What's going on, folks? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Cameron and this is my 2003 Jeep Wrangler TJ. And in this video, I'll be going over the process of prepping, painting, and installing this Barnes four-wheel drive bolt-on skid plate. Here's the transmission mount. Here's all the appropriate hardware that it came with. And here's the actual skid plate itself. So this is what the skid plate currently looks like, just as they sent it. Here's what the underside of that skid plate looks like. That is our CV drive shaft, and right there, coming out of the transfer case, is our slip yoke eliminator. You can see the yoke is here. That connects to the CV drive shaft, and our pinion angle is already adjusted. If you are doing this skid plate, it is smart to have a slip yoke eliminator and a CV drive shaft so that you're not raising your pinion angle too much, because if you do that, you might feel some vibrations and some unsteadiness in your driveline, and that's unsafe, and you're putting extra wear on some driveline components that you don't want. Here's our stock skid plate. We're going to measure how far it is from the ground so that we can compare that to the Barnes four-wheel drive skid plate, which should raise the ground clearance about an inch. From the lowest point on this stock skid plate, it's about 12 inches from the ground, and on the highest point from the stock skid plate, it's about 13 inches. And those 4 bolts are the bolts for the transmission mount that connect from the transmission to the skid plate here, and we want to line up those holes exactly as they are. So what we're going to do to prep this skid plate here is we're going to do a 2-part wet sand with our water here. This is a 200 grit sanding block, and this is a 400 grit sanding block. Start with the 200 block, then we'll finish with the 400 block. And we'll do the same thing as well to the transmission mount here. After we finish sanding them, we are going to spray them all down, dry them completely, and then wipe it down with some acetone as our finishing step before we spray paint it. Like all of my projects in which I use spray paint on the TJ, I'm going to be using the Rust-Oleum semi-gloss black here with this nice little Rust-Oleum trigger handle as well. Once I finish with that and let that fully dry, I'll be moving on to this semi-gloss clear coat, also by Rust-Oleum as well. It is now nice and shiny, and all the surface rust and debris has been removed from both the bottom and the top side of the skid plate. Now we're going to wipe it down with some acetone and start spray painting it. Alright, so I finished prepping the transmission mount and the actual skid plate. Now, let's get it on some jack stands and spray paint it. Alright, so I'm letting the skid plate and the transmission mount dry from their first coat of paint. Then I'm going to flip them over and do the underside and apply a clear coat. And we should all be good to go to get it installed and on the Jeep. In the meantime, I'll drop the other skid plate. Looks like my rear CV drive shaft pinion angle is -8 degrees, and that'll be perfect for accommodating bigger tires and a bigger lift later on. And now currently the Barnes bolt-on 2-inch skid plate. Now, in order to remove our stock skid plate here, we're going to need a floor jack or a bottle jack in order to support the rear drive shaft and the transfer case once we drop the transmission mount. And we're also going to need a floor jack in order to hold this up and safely lower it and wheel it out. We're also going to need a size 18mm socket head in order to remove those 3 bolts on either side of the skid plate, and a size 13mm socket head in order to get the transmission bolts undone. So I'm first going to start by removing the 4 13mm nuts connecting to the bolts that hold the transmission mount into place on the skid plate. Alright, now that I've removed the 4 nuts on the transmission mount, I can now start to remove the 6 bolts for the skid plate. Now it's time to flip the skid plate over and paint the underside. Alright, so we're going to abandon our original skid plate hardware entirely because Barnes sent 6 19mm bolts that we're going to use to mount our skid plate to our frame. And we also have these 4 hexagonal heads that are size 732. These and their 14mm nut will allow you to bolt the transmission mount onto the skid plate. Here's our old skid plate compared to our new skid plate. This is the thickness of the stock skid plate, and here's the thickness of the Barnes skid plate. You can see there's a tremendous difference. I know it looks a little powdery, but that's just from the wind blowing the clear coat, and it'll just wipe right off. I have experience with this. But the skid plate is now dry from the initial clear coat, and now it's time to flip it over and get the transmission mount bolted up onto here. Alright, so when bolting the stock skid plate up on the frame, while you can use the original skid plate and measure everything out, I just personally found this a little bit easier to do. Now it's time to bolt it on up there. Alright, on both sides I have the 3 bolts threaded into the frame. My adjustable clicker torque wrench by Tecton is now adjusted to 55 foot-pounds. Now we're going to torque all 6 bolts. All of the bolts are now torqued to 55 foot-pounds. Now we can lower the floor jack and we can tighten on our transmission mount. We can also remove our jack stand. And here we are, folks. Our brand new Barnes 4-wheel drive 2-inch bolt-on skid plate. It's now time to measure out and compare it to our stock skid plate. From the ground, we are at 14 inches, and that'll be 14. We have more clearance in the back here. That's 14 and a half. With this skid plate, we gained about 1 to 2 inches of clearance. Starting from the top of the skid plate on the inside, we're gonna measure the length. And that measurement there is about 21 inches. What's really nice about the skid plate is that it doesn't just cut off. There is a 1.5 inch lip here that goes up to the transmission and the transfer case. so that'll provide more protection when out on the trails. Stock skid plate is about 22.25 inches, but it doesn't have a lip that goes up on an angle like the Barnes skid plate does. I'm trying to line it up as best as I can, but because this phone is a bit large, it's catching on that part of the drive shaft there. We're at about -14. Previous was -8. That is still better than the stock drive shaft. Took it for a little shakedown drive last night and there were no vibrations. So I think that we are good to go. If at any point I do start experiencing some driveline vibrations, then I'll just have to adjust the pinion angle of the rear axle. Alrighty folks, well that'll conclude the video for prepping, painting, and installing the Barnes 4-wheel drive 2-inch bolt-on skid plate. Overall, I'm really happy with how it went and how smoothly it was. The only issue that I, ran into was the fact that I didn't have another person to try and help me line up the bolt holes on the other side. That definitely made it a little bit difficult, but I was able to do it, and I think it looks really good. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment or hit me up on Instagram at offcampertj. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day.